You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C. Okay, so Ankit, today let's sort of talk about U.S. relations with Pakistan, which has been in the headlines of late, beginning with Trump's inaugural New Year tweet, where he tweeted out a broadside against Pakistan, but then followed by several policy pronouncements, some of them not really clear, about U.S. restrictions and reductions in assistance to Pakistan. We're still not sure about the exact figures, but most of them involve military aid and coalition-related support funds to Pakistan, and that's sort of gotten the community of DC policy analysts, but also internationally, folks around the region talking about what the implications are, not only for U.S. foreign policy, but also, Pakistan's foreign alignments, South Asia, U.S. presence in Afghanistan. So a lot to talk about there. But you wrote a couple of pieces about Trump's initial tweets, but then also the subsequent policy proposals that have been adopted since. I mean, what's your take on what listeners should be watching for in terms of next steps, but also, how to put all of this in context, as always, with the Trump administration, as we've been talking about before?
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating topic. I'm glad we're digging into it a little deper on this podcast. I know we talked about it a bit on the last episode, just looking at what to watch for in 2018 in Asia, and I think certainly this will be one of the big stories. I think first maybe a good place to start is to talk about how not new a lot of this is, right? I mean, you look at the history of U.S.-Pakistan relations, and you see a history of dysfunction between these two countries that at their best times have considered each other difficult allies, and at their worst times have even considered each other enemies to an extent. Obviously, the Pakistan remains a major non-NATO ally of the United States, so there is this kind of veneer of friendship above all the unease that lays below the surface. Pakistan, we also should, make clear for readers that when we're talking about Pakistan, we're talking about a country that has been through repeated periods of rule by military, several military coups, most recently under General Pervez Musharraf after the 1990 coup against a 1999 coup against Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. Currently, civil-military relations in Pakistan remain difficult. I think it's important to distinguish in any conversation about Pakistani foreign policy and national interest the unique incentives that make the Pakistani military and intelligence services a powerful actor domestically, but also a powerful actor when it comes to guiding the country's foreign and security policy. And we see that reflected in both how Pakistan behaves in its neighborhood, especially with India and Afghanistan, but also certainly in how Pakistan navigates the alliance with the United States. And this is an alliance that has a bit of a patron-client relationship aspect to it, certainly, and that is the focus of the recent policy moves by the United States regarding the suspension of aid. So let's talk a bit about the aid. I mean, there's multiple kinds of aid that the United States gives to Pakistan. The numbers that we've seen in multiple reports have varied, but at least, the administration has confirmed that $255 million in foreign military financing will be suspended under the fiscal year 2018 appropriations, and then coalition support fund reimbursements, which are a larger sum and effectively give Pakistan money back for its efforts in combating terror groups, have also been suspended, but we don't specifically know that. But effectively, I mean, the big takeaway is that this is some amount of money that is larger, considerably larger than $255 million, potentially up to $1 billion, depending on whose numbers you're working with. To go back to the point of how not new this is, I mean, we've seen this before. We've seen this with the Obama administration. Obama was tough on Pakistan as a candidate. He was tough on Pakistan in 2009 in his first year in office. Just like Trump, he gave a speech on Afghanistan strategy. The United States has been, is entering its 17th year in Afghanistan now. So multiple presidents have recognized that a big problem for the United States and Pakistan is in Afghanistan is the support by Pakistan's military for various proxy groups in the country, helping destabilize it, including the Taliban. So, Obama did point out that Pakistan was a source of trouble. I mean, if you look at the words used in both speeches, Obama talked more about Pakistan in his speech than Trump did in August 2017 when he announced his own strategy. So the diagnosis isn't the difficult part. It has never been the difficult part. I mean, this is even an issue, like you pointed out, that has quite a degree of consensus within the DC community, the DC policymaker community, think tank community. Everybody recognizes that Pakistan is a difficult partner for the United States. What has been difficult is modifying Pakistan's behavior. And no American president has really figured out the key to that, partly because, depending on who you ask, they haven't been willing to push far enough. There is the common expression that Pakistan holds a gun to its head, and that gun is its nuclear weapons, which American analysts consistently worry about falling into the hands of non-state actors, terror groups, what have you. So Pakistan has a fair degree of leverage in that sense over the United States, in addition to the close historic ties between the two countries and the considerable military aid that has gone towards Pakistan. So that's what, I think the question is right now, is that the United States has done this before, has suspended aid, has taken pot shots at Pakistan rhetorically. The relationship's been difficult, but will anything change? And I'm not sure the answer to that is clear as of yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, the difficulty, I guess, the bigger, broader question is, as people look at this policy move in terms of the restrictions to assistance, and then they look at what probably the Trump administration strategy is going to be in terms of its outlines, in terms of either keeping the United States engaged in Afghanistan and potentially, sending more military personnel, equipment, maybe a potential escalation further out. If, Pakistan is not part of that effort, or there's a sense from the Pakistanis that they want to retaliate in some way, how is the United States going to manage that difficulty? And that, I guess, is probably a reason why some people are hesitating about that. And I'm sure you saw that there's all these media reports coming out. I think Reuters came out with a story saying that even though there has been a policy review going on in the Trump administration, they may have pulled the trigger a little bit too early in terms of Trump coming out with his tweets, and them having to struggle to come up with an actual policy response when in fact the actual policy review may have only been sort of due to be completed in March or April, and that would have sort of thought about these various scenarios about if Pakistan retaliates, how would the United States maybe use some alternative options. Now, we all know what those options are, and the U.S. can probably sort of conjure up some kind of response. But it's important to remember here, as you correctly pointed out, I mean, that Pakistan has its own agency. There are things that the Pakistanis can do in terms of making life difficult for the U.S. There's things that they can do with respect to China, which I guess is one angle that maybe we could explore more. I mean, you've written about China's involvement in South Asia before, the China-Pakistan relationship, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but also like some of the things that the Chinese have been doing diplomatically in the region too, in terms of engaging the Afghans and the Pakistanis. I mean, what's your sense of the China angle in all of this? I guess the conventional wisdom is that when the U.S. sort of pulls back, the Pakistanis will move closer towards the Chinese. But I guess there are some limits to that too, and the Pakistanis recognize that, whether it's with CPEC and the rest, right?
Yeah, I mean, so this has been actually, a little bit of a source of frustration, I guess, reading a lot of analysis about this move that Trump made. There's a lot of this right now that if Trump pulls back in some way, people will say, oh, this is a gift to China, and that China is going to be so happy that America is stepping back. And I actually really don't think that that's the case here at all. I think China recognizes the risks of Pakistan growing further destabilized, and they have benefited certainly from the United States supporting Pakistan militarily, encouraging Pakistan to take action against terrorists within its own borders, even if the Pakistani military has treated that as a secondary or rather performative priority. But the Chinese certainly aren't happy to see, Pakistan and the United States entering this period of difficulty again. In 2011, too, I think that was certainly the case. 2011 was a famously bad year in U.S.-Pakistan relations. Everything from the Raymond Davis affair to the unilateral assassination of Osama bin Laden on Pakistani territory by U.S. commandos. I think China's reaction to this is going to be a lot more nuanced than people think. So yes, there is the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which, the Chinese have committed multiple billions of dollars. The capital outlays are lower, but certainly this is, the crown jewel of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative right now. It connects the Arabian Sea port of Gwadar, a strategically significant entry point into Central Asia, Eurasia, the Eurasian landmass, connects Gwadar to Western China in Xinjiang. And securing that, securing those passages, securing those infrastructure projects, making sure that Chinese workers aren't harmed in Pakistan, all of these are important priorities for China right now. And, I mean, even if you look back at the history of just Pakistan-China relations, I was actually, browsing the CIA's library reading room and looking at some historical documents with intelligence assessments that the U.S. had delivered in, the 1970s, 1980s of China's relationship with Pakistan. And the U.S. has always been very clear about this, that Pakistan is always going to be closer to China than it will be to the United States on a strategic level, and when it comes to the level of the priorities of the Pakistani military. So the Pakistan-China relationship, I think, is important to Islamabad and to Rawalpindi. Rawalpindi being obviously the general headquarters of the Pakistani military, used as a metonym for the Pakistani military's interests. So both the civilians in Pakistan and the military recognize their relationship with China will be increasingly important, but that doesn't mean that China is a one-for-one substitute for what Pakistan gains from the United States. So I'm a little skeptical of this idea that China will sweep in and benefit with glee from this downturn in U.S.-Pakistan relations. If anything, I think Beijing would prefer the United States to retain a military presence in Afghanistan as long as Afghanistan can be stabilized or some sort of political settlement can be reached. I think Beijing is definitely interested in that. They just hosted the first inaugural meeting with the foreign ministers of Afghanistan and Pakistan, hosted in Beijing. So China is starting to take more of an interest in this, and not really starting. I mean, they've been playing a larger role with the Quadrilateral Coordination Group with the U.S. as well in that context. So I think there is a more nuanced angle to this, to China's role in this whole thing.
Right. And I guess the other big player we should probably talk about and touch on is implications for India, because relative to the U.S. relationship with Pakistan under the Trump administration, it appears that even though things were quite good under the Obama administration, whether you look at the national security strategy or some of the moves in the U.S.-India relationship, it seems like India does have a prominent role to play in the U.S. policy in the Asia Pacific thus far. And with moves like we've talked about before on this podcast, whether it's the quadrilateral or U.S. South Asia policy more generally, it does seem that there are some moves that we could see in U.S.-India relations for 2018 that would constitute significant strengthening for the relationship. But I guess from India's perspective, it seems like it's a bit of a mixed bag here too in terms of the U.S. approach to Pakistan. I mean, on the one hand, the Indians, haven't had a problem with times when the U.S. has had a closer relationship with India and sort of seen Pakistan as sort of more of a rogue partner. In fact, the Indians probably, have insisted several times that the United States should, forget, this idea that the Pakistanis can be actual allies in good faith, given the fact they've been playing this double game for so long. But on the other hand, the Indians, when you have periods where the United States has shifted too much towards India and more of an offshore role in South Asia, there's also this dynamic where the Pakistanis become more irresponsible actors in the region too, and that has negative implications for India that it has to deal with in its own neighborhood. So how do you see that picture evolving?
Yeah, I mean, somewhat predictably, there were quite a few excited headlines in India when Trump tweeted, and certainly when the announcements were made. Actually, I think even in anticipation of the announcements, Indian press, started reporting that the aid had already been suspended. I mean, the Indians are obviously enthusiastic about this. There has been this thread where many in India are glad to see the United States recognize Pakistan for what it is. This happened with Obama, too, in 2009. And, I think the Indians have been pleasantly surprised by their success with the Trump administration. I mean, early in 2017, there were still no guarantees about whether the Trump administration would commit what the Indians see as a fatal mistake in U.S. policy and look to bilaterally, mediate in the Kashmir dispute, which was still hot at that time. And especially if you remember that ridiculous readout that came out between then President-elect Trump and Nawaz Sharif, right, when the Pakistanis put a bunch of words in Trump's mouth. So I think, there was some concern in India that Trump might look at South Asia as a secondary priority in the Asia Pacific or rather the Indo-Pacific, I should say, and treat it with, disinterest, look to maybe bilaterally mediate in Kashmir. So, I mean, obviously none of that happened, and the Indians have been pleasantly surprised. I think we should probably also recognize that a lot of this has been due to successful Indian diplomacy. I think the Indians have worked hard to get in on the ground floor of this administration's kind of strategy review towards South Asia, get Trump to regard Modi as a partner on a personal level, and those efforts have paid off. I mean, we've talked about it in the East Asian context before with the reconvening of the Quadrilateral, the introduction of the Indo-Pacific concept so heavily this year, but certainly in South Asia, I think the Indians are seeing dividends on their reach their outreach to the United States with this Pakistan policy. And again, I mean, without knowing if U.S. conditionality can actually work against Pakistan, I'm still skeptical that it can. It remains to be seen if this is going to be short-lived optimism with India. The line of control remains as unstable as ever. Ceasefire violations continue in Kashmir. India and Pakistan are far from, out of the woods when it comes to their own bilateral troubles. I don't think that the United States can really play that kind of a role. But I think we should be talking a bit about, some of the coercive tools that remain in the U.S. toolkit, right? I mean, suspending funding, I think, is not going to do the job. Pakistan has seen this before. They've prepared for it. They invest quite a bit in indigenous technology. I mean, actually, just right after the U.S. suspended aid to Pakistan, Pakistan tested a new ship-launched cruise missile and touted its own indigenous defense, investments. I think, maybe that was a message, maybe that wasn't a message, but, it underlines that Pakistan can still sustain quite a bit of defense research and development and progress without U.S. funding, obviously. But, one tool that the United States hasn't tried that has been mentioned, at least by Michael Anton, Trump's NSC spokesperson, is potentially the idea of targeted sanctions against Pakistani individuals in the armed forces. The United States hasn't done that yet, and that would make life difficult for certain Pakistani military officials. But that, the flip side of that is that it may take the U.S.-Pakistan relationship beyond a line or onto a path of no return, rather, where relations start to get so acrimonious and so bad, and the United States sees direct retaliation from the Pakistanis, including a suspension of the use of Karachi, which is going to grow increasingly important. Just as, you just pointed this out, that it's absolutely incongruous that the United States would announce a troop surge in Afghanistan, where we now have 14,000 troops, up from 8,400 at the end of the Obama administration. So, they announce a troop surge in Afghanistan, and then they announce sanctions, or not sanctions, but, an aid suspension against Pakistan, potentially drawing a reprisal. I mean, without Karachi, logistics and supply for the 14,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan is going to be considerably more expensive and difficult. It's been done through the North before, but that network doesn't exist anymore. So there are ways that the Pakistanis can make life difficult for the United States. And, they can revoke, access to the United States for, targeted killings and drone strikes in the federally administered tribal areas, the northwest of the country along the Durand line. So there are ways that Pakistan can retaliate. I think we're going to see that if we see 2018 turn into possibly the most acrimonious year in U.S.-Pakistan relations since 2011.
Right. And I'd agree with that. I mean, the sense is that, this could be, just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to either further moves that the U.S. could take or potential retaliatory moves from Pakistan. And in that sense, it's pretty worrying for the rest of 2018. I mean, I guess the saving grace perhaps is that we still don't know whether this is sort of a broad, well thought out, comprehensive approach by the Trump administration that's going to be rolled out, or whether this is something that, as you said, could be short lived. I did want to touch a little bit before we go on sort of the end game to all this, right? So we've talked about measures the U.S. has taken, potentially retaliatory steps by Pakistan, foreign alignments that Pakistan has, its own defense developments. But the one piece that I guess that would lead us to either think about whether this is some kind of Trump transactional approach, or whether there's a particular endgame to all of this, is the diplomatic side of things, right? So whether there could eventually be some kind of political settlement involving the Taliban, whether it's led by the U.S. or some other forces as well. I mean, what's your sense as to whether, we could see some kind of diplomatic outreach or diplomatic component to U.S. strategy? Because so far, I guess, based on what we've seen, there's been a lack of attention to diplomacy, all this stuff about the gutting of the State Department, and sort of an overall perception of a lack of coherence of U.S. policy. But, it is still early days. What's your sense about whether, we could see something like that? And if we did, is it, too heavy of a lift, or could this actually make a difference?
I think it's probably too heavy of a lift. Nothing against the U.S. diplomatic corps, but in Pakistan, the problem, it seems, has always been, with this civil-military divide, you mostly have diplomats interfacing with the Pakistani Foreign Office, the Prime Minister's advisor on foreign affairs, usually receiving platitudes and assurances that aren't watertight guarantees. And for listeners who are interested in actually more of this, we actually, on this podcast a few years ago, had Cameron Munter, who was the U.S. ambassador to Pakistan in 2011, that very difficult year of the relationship. So if you're interested in hearing, a firsthand perspective of what it's like to be the top U.S. envoy in the country, go check that podcast out. It was a very good conversation. We don't really have a good idea of what the Trump administration's end state is, and that's obviously important to think about with any strategy. What kind of end state is this administration trying to achieve in Pakistan? I think they're trying to get the Pakistani government or get the Pakistani military to take its counterterrorism commitments that are often voiced loudly as a serious priority, not only as a performative priority to continue receiving U.S. aid. That includes, targeting the Haqqani network, targeting the Pakistani Taliban, withholding support for Afghanistan-based proxies, including the Afghan Taliban, allowing them to organize on Pakistani soil. The administration has said that they've given Pakistan a specific list of deliverables without clarifying what those deliverables are, and remains to be seen if those are so specific. Are we talking about a map being handed over to the Pakistani military with specific militant camps that the United States has intelligence about but doesn't have access to with its drones? Is the U.S. requesting that the Pakistani military go in and take out certain high-value targets there? That's one thing. Or is the United States making a specific demand that take action against, some percentage of the fighters who are fighting with the Haqqani network? It's hard to know, but the answers to those questions, I think, will determine the extent to which, we should take this current U.S. strategy a little bit more seriously. It's easy to lash out against Pakistan, right? Obama did it, Bush did it, other U.S. presidents have done it, but it's difficult to change Pakistan's behavior. It's difficult to change any sovereign state's national interests, right? That's effectively what is at stake here for Pakistan. And we've talked a bit about this before. The Pakistani militaries, raison d'etre, a strategic culture, are entirely built around opposition to India on one hand and preserving strategic depth in Afghanistan by destabilizing the central government in Kabul. And changing those isn't a matter of flicking some switches, turning off a little aid. Even sanctions probably can't go far enough. So for now, I'm skeptical that even diplomacy can really help shift the needle here. But this is the latest administration to try. Things are a little different with Pakistan and China, with the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So that's a new variable, although I don't think it's the variable that some people think it is. But in general, I'll say that I'm pretty skeptical that this approach to Pakistan will work for the United States.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I'd also say, the Pakistanis have long thought that the United States is by no means a permanent and reliable variable in South Asia. The sense is that the United States presence will sort of wax and wane, and so there's a sense that credibility there is an issue too. And as you correctly pointed out, that the United States is ultimately going to focus more on India rather than Pakistan.
Right.
So Pakistan's always got to have this China relationship and always have these relationships with certain militant groups, at least seen from their perspective. So, I guess like many things we've discussed in the Trump administration and U.S. Asia more broadly, I guess it remains to be seen what we'll actually see for the rest of 2018. But I guess we'll leave it there for now.
Yep.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening, and do leave us a review if you like what you're hearing. It always helps.
Thanks, Prashant.